Look, I'm not gonna get cute and fuck around with this one. I can't remember the last time I was this torn about a film. This movie hit me in places I wasn't ready to be hit. I was impressed and invested and repulsed in new and interesting ways. Until I wasn't. This was purposefully constructed and marketed to make sure that your first viewing experience was felt in your gut like a punctured, pulsating ulcer. I felt allergic to it for each of the 72 minutes that it took to get from this to this. Two movie deaths so tonally dissonant that they can't possibly exist in the same movie. Certainly not one touted as the best horror movie in half a century. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Is this guy an artistic genius? That would be really fun and exciting if it turns out to be true, but I don't know. There's an exploitative quality to his first feature film that either works incredibly well in support of the theme, or it doesn't work and is potentially reckless to the point of being dangerous. Hereditary is a sorrowful story of grief and dysfunction, whose neutral telling is usurped by a psychopath and gradually, rhetorically manipulated into a posthumous plea for acquittal. A suicide note, written by the daughter of a spiritual occultist who, after the death of her mother, seeks to shed blame for the dysfunction in her life. And after the death of her daughter, seeks to cease living. It is a pitch-black, guttural experience that mechanically plots and positions its audience on a singular hill upon which to die. Annie's family is doomed by prophecy to die in the name of a rising evil, an oracle passed down through blood, an unconditional consequence of the hand that they each were dealt. Except Steve, but we'll get to him. This wasn't your fault. We stand up and offer as we leave the theater. This was always going to happen. There was nothing you could do. This wasn't your fault. Unless, of course, you made the whole thing up.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
The Usual Suspects is a 1995 film starring Gabriel Byrne as a man whose death is used within a story told by a monster as an elaborate ruse to manipulate his audience into granting him immunity for his crimes. This is one of the most famous cinematic examples of a storytelling technique called the unreliable narrator. It is a technique most often used to make the audience question or downright disbelieve a story as presented. A criminal tells a lie to escape capture. A defendant on trial for murder fakes a mental disorder to get off scot-free. A desperate man hallucinates a mentor to guide him on a path to self-actualization. The audience takes the journey at face value, presuming the storyteller's neutrality, which is to say, we presume innocence until guilt is proven, which does tend to happen in these stories. In The Usual Suspects, the detective realizes that the story he's been told by the criminal was fabricated on the spot, using details derived from the wall right behind him. He gives chase to his suspect, but it's too late. He got away. Now, okay, go with me here. I want to try something. Imagine that the final scene doesn't happen. Verbal is granted immunity and chided by the detective. Gabriel Byrne's character takes the blame, and the movie ends on a fade-out from the smiling face of the detective, left believing he was right all along. Do you question it? Does it work? Sure, it may not go down in cinema history like it did, but it's still a solid crime thriller where the bad guy is exposed. The detective proves his theory, and yeah, some people die, but it's a genre story. That was always going to happen. The ending proves that everything was a lie, but without that last scene, is it not still a lie? Okay, now imagine that Hereditary ends with the camera leaving the tableau, as presented in the treehouse. It moves backward through the front door. We see Steve's burnt body in the living room, and the camera moves upstairs and slowly enters the attic. But the door is no longer locked as we left it before Annie's body inexplicably manifested itself in the rafters. The camera moves toward the broken window we saw Peter leap out of, and we notice the decaying body of Annie's mother to our left, and a shadow swaying on the floor. The camera pans upward to reveal Annie's hanging body, still connected firmly to her head. The final shot of the film reveals Peter's body, dead in the flowers. Do you question it? Does it work? If you can grant me for the sake of conversation that Annie is an unreliable narrator, which I understand is a fairly speculative read on the film, then ask yourself this: who is telling the story, and why? In the examples I've listed, revealing the lie happens in service of fulfilling our protagonist's goals. Verbal Kint doesn't just get away, he outwits the detective and furthers the myth of criminal mastermind Kaiser Soze. Richard Gere doesn't just win his murder trial, but has his entire professional philosophy thrown into question. Tyler Durden has to be revealed as a lie for Ed Norton's narrator to realize any actual autonomy. It's for them. The storyteller reveals the lie so that the audience can see the protagonist achieve the goals the story has been building to. The first shot of Hereditary has us unambiguously enter the story through one of Annie's miniature models. Models that she builds as a seemingly therapeutic exercise intended to immortalize a neutral view of events from her past. A way to look at her trauma that purposefully detaches her from it. She also seems to have found professional success exhibiting these pieces in a New York art gallery. Her entire life centers around carefully, meticulously constructing tableau vivant versions of a violent past that render her blameless. This is the mindset and motivation of our storyteller. Her goals, as stated in the film, are...
I just don't want to put any more stress on my family.
And...
I just want to die.
And I get that these can both be viewed as just things that she says, but by the end of the film, this is unarguably what she achieves. Her actions belie her intent to get there, but that's the point. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world she doesn't exist. There is a moment in this film that, for me, turns the handle that opens the door into just how dark Ari Aster intended this to get. And it's right here. It's a few scenes later, about 8 minutes of runtime that passes before Annie runs into Joan in a parking lot and gets introduced to the idea of the seance. Just enough time, really, for the audience to be reasonably expected to miss a very specific detail. That isn't Joan's door. It's Annie's. Yeah, so the narrative that would have us suspend disbelief that Annie's mother was the leader of a cult that, in order to gain a cartoonish pile of pirate booty, hatched a plan 13 years ago to summon Payman, the god of mischief, by planting an equally cartoonish pile of walnuts at a high school stoner party, which, by the way, was only attended by Charlie at the insistence of Annie, who supposedly has no idea about any of it, and also by planting a deer carcass next to a sanctified telephone pole so that the decapitated head of the daughter of our unassuming heroine can be collected in broad daylight, and presumably stored by a crazy person until the time was right to jam it onto the neck of a wooden art mannequin so that their purposeless king can stare at it blankly before doing something with a camel? Anyway, yeah, so that same narrative also implies that the seance Joan claims to have attended, the one she lied about to get Annie to come to her house, actually happened, or at least was planned to the point of having a date, location, celebrity host, and professionally produced marketing materials. But why? Either the event was real and the cult failed to get Annie to attend, or the event wasn't real and the movie just wanted to plant a seed of credibility to Joan's story. But in either case, why is this shot there? Its only purpose within the narrative is to provide evidence of a thing that either failed or didn't exist. I noticed it on my second viewing, after the first left me feeling trolled by a movie that seemed to provide a demon as an excuse to be relieved that everybody died. And it legitimately broke my brain. I had to pause the movie and work my way to a very important conclusion. This was a conscious choice. Annie is a character who, in addition to being a self-obsessed narcissist who vehemently denies culpability for her actions and failings by claiming to have been victimized by forces outside of her control,
Because it happened while I was asleep.
she also creates art under the impossible pretense that she can tell her own story without bias or agenda.
No, it's a neutral view of the accident.
She plays equal parts author and star of the stories she tells, taking cues from other people's art
Okay, well, I'm gonna go see a movie.
and wielding credibility with either a desperate hope that it is hers to assume or a willful ignorance that it's out of her control. Think of it this way. Verbal Kint plays both author and star of the story he tells to the cops. He weaponizes the inherent credibility that he's offered as a storyteller in a race against the clock because he knows that he needs to get out of that office as Verbal Kint before he's found out to be Kaiser Soze. His credibility exists only until the eyewitness sketch arrives and/or the detective turns around and sees that he's been spitballing this story using details from pictures from the wall right behind him. It's a verbal story, undone by pictures. Kaiser Soze understood this. Annie does not. And so she leaves behind her story, presented here in pictures, only to be undone if we can just turn around and look at the damn wall. The visual storytelling of Hereditary mounts an assault on the credibility of the story unfolding, and it gets pretty overt by the end. But then again, it's fighting against the soft, nougaty satisfaction of, nah, a demon did it. So get ready for a bucket full of Necco wafers and candy corn, because this shit gets pretty hard to swallow after a while. Charlie's death may be one of the most exhaustively foreshadowed movie deaths ever.
There aren't nuts in that.
Does that have nuts? Because we don't have the EpiPen.
Everything we know about Charlie and Peter plays a role in explaining how much sense it makes that this happens. Charlie loves chocolate. She is allergic to nuts. Charlie does not want to be at this party. Peter likes girl. Peter wants to smoke weed and do teenagey alone stuff with girl. Charlie is left alone with no one to talk to, but at least there's cake. Yada yada yada. Boom. Yeah, that's it. That's all we get to set up or explain what happens to Steve. Book burns and sets Annie's sleeve on fire, so this is how Steve dies. Steve, who loved, counseled, lived, and died in just the manner that suited the monster in his bed. Who cared for his kids' futures and grieved in complete solitude. Who must have seemed a tricky eyewitness disposal to weave into the internal logic of our killer's story. So she didn't. And what does it matter, really? Because, Steve was our emotional grounding throughout the movie, our proxy, our tether to reality. And so he is taken down by his own daughter's sketch journal and its extremely questionable supernatural agenda. Because every time reality steps in to question Annie's neutral version of events, she has to stamp it out. My favorite example of this whole Annie and the camera duking it out for the audience's attention thing comes in this scene. We are expected to see Peter's hallucination as supernatural and believe, or at least disregard our disbelief of, Annie's explanation here, because in the end it doesn't matter. But look at what the visual storytelling is actually saying. Peter has already been shown to be startled by ordinary things around his room since Charlie died. Here he sees Charlie's face and it turns out it's just a Nerf ball. There's a precedent for that. The hands that try to pull his head off are pretty clearly Annie's, but since she is shown to be a vessel for the demon in the text of the story, that's neither here nor there until you get to this.
What's wrong, baby? What's happening?
Did you catch that? Watch the edit. The door is slammed shut from the inside in a shot that shows us no one enters the room around the dog. We hear the door slam over a shot of Steve sleeping downstairs. Just as the scene comes to a head and we may wonder if this is another dream sequence, there's our rock, our tether to reality. This is not a dream. Then we hard cut to Annie standing on the side of the room from which the door was slammed, and she frantically tells Peter she just walked in. She lies to Peter's face about having just tried to kill him. There's a precedent for that, too. And in doing so, lies right through the screen and tells us that we most definitely did not see what we most definitely just saw. Or not. This is Ari Aster's directorial debut, so maybe if I'm going to talk about visual storytelling being incongruent with a story, I should be directing my criticism in his direction.
Or at his direction.
I mean, who am I to assume what is a conscious choice, and moreover, what is intended by them? I just find it a little hard to believe that the guy that delivered this gut punch just forgot somewhere in post everything he ever knew about the cool shot effect.
That's the relationship your brain creates between two images when shot together in succession. It's a very basic visual storytelling technique.
Maybe the editing was just disjointed to support the general through line of descending into madness. I don't know. There's no track record. But there is a distinct level of meticulous care in how Aster presents this story. It's pretty well documented that the sets for the house interior were built in full and designed specifically to accommodate the lateral tracking and general shot composition that would best emulate the feeling of looking at dolls in a dollhouse.
These are people who have no agency, and, in the end, they are like dolls in a dollhouse.
But you can't have it both ways. Either the movie is played straight, or the story and the camera disagree on what's important. So, which would you rather believe? In the end, it kind of doesn't matter, because
Sophocles wrote the oracle so that it was unconditional, meaning Heracles never had any choice, right? So does that make it more tragic or less tragic than if he has a choice?
Because it's the wrong question. Heracles wasn't a character in Oedipus Rex. Kind of an odd mistake for a movie that contains so many references to that exact play. Obviously, I believe that this was an intentional mistake, as it supports my theory that this story is being told from the point of view of someone who doesn't understand the story she's emulating. Fucking play is called Oedipus Rex. But even if it's the other way around, intentionally or accidentally, it means the same thing. Oedipus was left for dead on a mountain by his parents, who wanted to escape the oracle's prophecy that their son would kill his father and sleep with his mother. He was then found and adopted, and later goes on a journey to find the oracle and learn who his real parents are. Instead, he learns of the things that he is destined to do: kill his father, sleep with his mother. He ends up doing both, unknowing of who they are at the time. The question of choice, as presented in this scene, is referencing the unconditional nature of destiny, and how that affects the tragedy of his story, but that misunderstands the concepts of both destiny and choice. Think of destiny as the final page in a book. It exists. A character in a story cannot change it, but it does not inform the decisions made on any previous page. At no point in the story of Oedipus does the character cease to have agency. The oracle doesn't make the prophecy come true. Oedipus does. He has control over the life that he leads, and he leads a life that includes killing his father, making a set of his own siblings, and gouging his eyes out in exile. Destiny comes from the choices we make, not the other way around. The oracle knew this, but that's just something oracles do.
She told you exactly what you needed to hear.
Destiny is a thing only knowable from the reader's vantage point. The control that one has when reading a story or watching a movie is the order in which the story is consumed, our perception of events. We have the freedom to flip to the last page anytime we want, but like the characters, knowing the ending doesn't change it. What can change is our sense of tragedy. The unconditional nature of this ending does toy with our sense of empathy for these characters. Perhaps not so much for this scene. I mean, a dead kid's a dead kid. But here, the scene that fully immerses us in the devastation and uncertainty of this family's situation, that nauseous feeling that comes from genuine empathy and real tragedy, is rendered relatively moot by Now, controlling one's perspective and seeing the story with an ironic bent kind of alters the relationship between the ending and the rest of the story, but as I said, I'm just speculating. On its surface, the movie serves as either a celebration of the sadism of the horror experience, or an indictment of it. Or it's trying to be both. Again, I don't know. There's no track record. But while the intent may be up for discussion, the approach certainly isn't.
These are people who have no agency. They are like dolls in a dollhouse.
Annie builds dollhouses to make sense of her life, to tell her story the way she prefers it be told, her story being the only thing within her control that she will leave behind for those who inherit it to benefit from. So, how will you remember her? As the protagonist of an entertaining story? Or as a memento of a less informed time? This question is not mutually exclusive to Dolls in a Dollhouse. Now, I know it's pretty unclear as to whether or not I actually liked this movie, so don't get me wrong, it's really, really good. It's beautifully shot, superbly performed, and purposefully executed. But it filled me with a sense of foreboding danger that compelled me to write this piece. In short, it feels just a little disingenuous to call this movie a masterpiece and then ignore anything about it that sets it apart. If the consensus is both, it's a masterpiece, and then I'm a little confused by either the movie or the response. And this is not a question of intent. I've laid pretty bare what I think the intent was, but it doesn't matter, because sorry, Ari, it doesn't belong to you anymore. That's what stories do. Once told, they become the burden of the audience. What we do with our stories, how we define them, frame them, and ultimately pass them down, is a reflection of ourselves to those we leave behind. Stories are hereditary. And I get it, we love the things we love and assign them value based on our desire to do so, But for a generation that seems to pride itself on its capacity for conversation, it's a little underwhelming to see our lack of interest in a thing we've assigned so much value to. It's just a movie, I know, but movies matter, or at least they can matter, as a representation of us at any given time. I doubt you'd have made it 25 minutes into this video if you didn't believe that on some level, what we choose to value plays a role in where we end up. If Ari Aster is a genius, then he made a movie that may have successfully exploited our desire to keep our troubles wrapped up in a tidy little genre box. If he's not, which is fine, then he made a movie that I'm having a hard time loving. Because whether intentional or otherwise, to imply that choice is a casualty of destiny is to just invent a boogeyman for the third act.
It is a very sorrowful film that is about death, and it's about grief and trauma.
One that tears down the very framework of your story and shifts the focus from empathy to dread.
But if you make that as a, you know, as a drama, then, well, you know, one, good luck finding financing. And then if you have found the financing, you know, good luck recouping.
A story designed to be misread.
So you've got things like the little miniatures, which you kind of question, you go, oh, is there something going on there?
Right.
But no, there's not.
To be passed down through the generations. And your friend the boogeyman will look out at those you've left behind from a less informed time and whisper, "This wasn't your fault. This was always going to happen."
Or at his direction. It's too early.
Sorry, I was trying to time it right. And I'm not actually getting as much enjoyment out of it as I think. Oh, this apple is fucked.
All right, you ready?
Yeah.